I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country.
At 3:42 a.m., far out in the Caribbean Sea, a dark silhouette cut through the water off Venezuela's shoreline. No lights, no markings, just a ghostly freighter stirring the stillness. On board, the U.S. Navy's P-8A Poseidon, radar locked onto that lone dot, and a fast-moving response team prepared to act. Moments later, a helicopter from the HITRON unit unleashed precision fire at the stern. Smoke billowed, metal screamed, and an operation that seemed routine exploded into something far larger. At first glance, this looked like another interception of a smuggling ship. Yet inside its cargo hold lay the evidence of an empire valued at $4.8 billion. A criminal network so entrenched it blurred the line between cartel and state. Already, intelligence had flagged 3 heavily fortified sites within Venezuela, hidden production hubs, training camps, cash laundering nodes, protected not just by armed guards, but by layers of official complicity and high-level corruption. Now the United States was entering a new phase. No longer content with chasing boats, it was aiming to dismantle systems. The moment had arrived for heavy bombers, elite troops, and covert technology to converge in a strike that would echo across the Americas. What if one small freighter caught before dawn could ignite a chain of events powerful enough to expose a $4.8 billion narco state and prove that in modern warfare, a single radar blip can redraw the balance of power? If you want to get the full story of how the world's oldest strategic bomber might have just leveled part of the world's biggest illicit empire, make sure you subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because the next 26 minutes are going to change how you see modern warfare. At dawn, when the Caribbean Sea still held its calm, the seizure of the anonymous freighter revealed more than a simple smuggling attempt. On board, U.S. Coast Guard teams uncovered 3.8 metric tons of methamphetamine and approximately $62 million in marked U.S. currency, along with encrypted digital drives that traced a sophisticated financial and production network. The data extracted from those drives painted a chilling picture. 3 fortified sites inside Venezuela, each serving a distinct purpose in a narco-state system. The first appeared to be a disguised sugar refinery near the coast, masking a large-scale meth production line. The second looked like a training compound where foreign mercenaries and cartel foot soldiers drilled for operations. The third was a financial hub hidden in the shadows of Caracas, routing cash and digital funds through Panama and Hong Kong fronts. Intelligence gathered by agencies including the CIA, NSA, and U.S. Southern Command concluded that this was no longer a crime ring. It was, in effect, a parallel state supported by corrupt officials. The U.S. government deemed the threat direct and immediate. Venezuela's government, according to the intelligence, was not merely turning a blind eye. It was actively providing protection to these sites, allowing the network to flourish under its flag. With this backing, the network's reach threatened the national security of the United States. U.S. officials began to describe the situation not as a law enforcement problem, but as a national defense one. And then came the key decision. From the cold waters of the Caribbean to the Situation Room in Washington, a shift occurred. Within hours of the freighter's interdiction, the White House authorized a broader military campaign. Codenamed Operation Iron Tide, the plan would bring together strategic bombers, special forces units, and naval assets. The mission would move from interception to full-scale disruption. What began as a routine bust at sea had now triggered a chain reaction that could redraw the line between organized crime and hostile power. If one anonymous ship in the Caribbean could hide the blueprint of a $4.8 billion empire, what exactly happened in those dark waters that forced Washington to move from investigation to war? Over the southern Caribbean, the air was thick with humidity and silence. Far below, a lone freighter crept along Venezuela's coastline, unlit, unmarked, and seemingly adrift in the dark. But the radar aboard a U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon saw through the deception, a faint but deliberate motion heading north at low speed. Within minutes, a helicopter from the Coast Guard's HITRON unit approached, its targeting systems locking onto the vessel's stern. A short burst of precision fire followed. In just 11 minutes, the chase ended. Smoke drifted from the wounded hull, and what looked like another routine anti-smuggling interception would soon expose something far greater than anyone anticipated. When Coast Guard teams boarded the freighter, they found themselves standing inside the shell of an empire. Hidden in its cargo hold were 3.8 metric tons of methamphetamine and more than $62 million in marked U.S. currency. A staggering haul, but still not the most valuable discovery. Locked inside the ship's navigation room were several encrypted hard drives, later described by officials as the true breakthrough. Those devices contained GPS coordinates, coded financial ledgers, and transaction records stretching across continents. Investigators traced transfers through shell companies in Panama and Hong Kong, linking the vessel to a complex network that blended organized crime with state protection. As the data was decrypted, a clearer picture began to form. 3 fortified sites inside Venezuela appeared again and again in the files. One was disguised as a sugar refinery near Puerto Cabello, secretly producing meth on an industrial scale. Another was a remote training compound north of Maracaibo, where foreign mercenaries and cartel recruits practiced tactical drills. The third was an unassuming warehouse in Caracas that functioned as a command and finance hub, routing money and communications across borders. What emerged from these findings was not the profile of a cartel. It was the infrastructure of a state-sponsored enterprise. Analysts at the CIA, the NSA, and U.S. Southern Command concluded that what they were observing went beyond criminal activity. This was a narco state, a hybrid system in which production, protection, and political authority overlapped. Intelligence suggested that high-ranking Venezuelan officials were not simply tolerating the operation, but safeguarding it, providing military cover and diplomatic immunity. Under that shield, billions of dollars in narcotics revenue flowed into a global network of accounts, hidden behind trade shipments and state-owned industries. The evidence forced U.S. policymakers to confront a new reality. The drug trade in the Caribbean was no longer just a criminal problem. It was a national security threat. From a single freighter adrift in international waters, the focus in Washington shifted dramatically. Within hours of the interdiction, reports flooded into the Situation Room. The intelligence pointed to a scale of corruption and militarization that could destabilize the entire hemisphere. By nightfall, the discussion no longer centered on arrest or prosecutions. It turned to deterrence. President Trump's advisors presented a list of options, each escalating in scope. At the top of that list was a coordinated military response designed to dismantle the narco state's infrastructure before it could recover or retaliate. That proposal became Operation Iron Tide. It would merge the precision of intelligence agencies with the firepower of the U.S. military, deploying strategic bombers, Navy SEAL teams, and specialized Coast Guard and Army Ranger units. The operation's aim was not merely to intercept shipments, but to destroy the system that produced them. In less than 24 hours, preparations began at Barksdale Air Force Base and across Caribbean command centers. The plan marked a clear transition. From policing to warfare, from counter-narcotics to counter-state action. If this was true, then what had begun as a drug trafficking bust evolved into a covert war between states. The seaborne spark triggered a blaze of military mobilization, intelligence assessment, and tactical design. The freighter wasn't just carrying drugs, it was carrying the key to a hidden empire that threatened to undermine the rule of law, exploit sovereign territory, and pour illicit profits into the open economy. That high-stakes realization forced the United States to recalibrate its response. But how did Washington turn that discovery into action? What kind of strike could reach deep inside Venezuela, silence its defenses, and dismantle a billion-dollar network before dawn? Late into the evening of October 13th, in the secure environs of the White House Situation Room, President Donald Trump and and his national security team pored over maps laid out across a long table. The intelligence briefing had just revealed 3 high-value targets inside Venezuela: a sugar refinery complex near Puerto Cabello, masking meth manufacture, a remote training camp north of Maracaibo for foreign mercenaries and cartel recruits, and a covert data financial warehouse in Caracas, routing funds through Panama and Hong Kong. This was far beyond traditional drug interdiction. The U.S. leadership now viewed the network as a near-state apparatus. Within hours, the decision was signed. Operation Iron Tide would commence. At 2 a.m. local time the following morning, 3 B-52H Stratofortress heavy bombers rolled down the runway at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. These warplanes, long-range and able to carry thousands of pounds of precision-guided munitions, reflected a dramatic shift from patrols to strategic strike. Escorting them would be F-15E Eagle fighters and EA-18G Growler electronic warfare jets, pushing deep into the Caribbean airspace. As the bombers aloft passed through the Yucatan Channel and entered their strike corridor, KC-135 air refuelers met the mid-air, extending their range far beyond previous operations. Satellite tracking and AWACS airborne command platforms monitored every move, while Aegis-equipped ships at sea scanned for threats. Having such layers of technology and coordination in motion meant that what began as a maritime chase had now evolved into a full-spectrum military operation. According to open-source intelligence, at least 2 B-52s performed holding patterns off Venezuela's northern coast in mid-October, signaling a formidable U.S. presence. In the strike corridor, the trio of B-52s carried bombs weighing up to 2,000 pounds each guided to target by satellite linking and laser designation from forward air controllers on the ground or from overhead drones. The F-15E provided air supremacy, while the Growlers jammed Venezuelan radar and communications to blunt any early warning. Together, the formation moved like a single war machine. The bombers released their weapons near the sugar refinery site, the drones relayed imagery, and within minutes, the training camp and data warehouse found themselves within the same operational window. The air refuelers quietly loitered beyond radar coverage, ready to extend the reach if the mission pushed further inland. The technological complexity behind this campaign cannot be overstated. This was not merely bombers flying in formation. The U.S. deployed AWACS aircraft to manage the airspace picture, linking air, sea, and ground operations in real time. Ships stationed near the Caribbean sea lanes used their Aegis systems to monitor missile and electronic threats. Drones provided surveillance and laser designation, effectively turning every U.S. asset into a node in one large targeting network. Analysts have described this sort of integration as the hallmark of 21st century precision warfare, and here it was applied halfway across the world at a moment's notice. As the bombers crossed into radar proximity over Venezuelan airspace, the message was clear. When the 3 bright dots appeared on the coastal radar screens, Caracas was being watched, and as the weapons fell, the terrain transformed. Buildings collapsed, fires raced up from fuel storage, and communications cables went dead. The strike window lasted only minutes, yet it ushered in a new era of confrontation. One U.S. official summarized it starkly: "We're looking at land now because we've got the sea under control." If the earlier freighter chase was the spark, this airborne assault was the flame. What began as one vessel in international waters grew into a multi-domain campaign designed to cut the head off a network valued at billions. If the mission succeeded, the U.S. would not simply hit a warehouse or sink another boat. It would dismantle the architecture of a narco state from above. But when the order was finally given, and those B-52s crossed into Venezuelan airspace, what exactly did their payload unleash? And how did one night of fire from the sky rewrite the balance of power on the ground? At 2:10 a.m., the sky above the first target flashed. What had started as a daring interdiction at sea hours earlier, advanced into something far more deliberate. Precision strikes from the air that turned a disguised sugar refinery into rubble. According to U.S. officials, strategic bombers carrying guided munitions struck the complex suspected of hiding meth production lines, and the explosions were strong enough that remote seismic sensors registered the blast. The move marked a decisive shift from maritime interdiction to direct kinetic action on land, and it was meant to sever the narco state's production backbone in one sharp blow. The weapon of choice for that opening salvo was the GBU-31 class of 2,000-pound precision bombs, dropped from high altitude and steered by satellite guidance to minimize collateral damage while guaranteeing target destruction, U.S. sources say. The detonation set off adjacent chemical stores, turning the refinery into a field of fire and sending black, acrid plumes miles into the Caribbean night. Those fumes forced rescue teams to work under chemical hazard protocols as drones and aircraft streamed live imagery back to command centers. While the imagery showed dramatic structural collapse and raging secondary fires, it was the forensic haul recovered afterwards. Fragments of processing equipment, ruined ledger books, and scorched server racks that proved the site's true purpose. Once the B-52s withdrew to safe standoff distances, the next phase began. MH-60M Blackhawks, carrying Army Rangers and Navy SEALs, slid in low and fast to secure the perimeter and exploit the strike's surprise. Ground teams moved with urgency, establish a cordon, sweep for survivors, and locate any intact digital evidence. That close-quarters insertion was always the riskiest part of the plan. As the assault unfolded, armed pickups with heavy-caliber DSHK machine guns engaged the helicopters and ground teams, and an ammunition cache detonated in a nearby yard, creating chaotic shrapnel fields and forcing medevac procedures to begin under fire. U.S. military briefings later confirmed several wounded were evacuated to nearby ships for treatment. The firefight that followed was intense, but brief. Special operations units, trained for lightning-fast entry and close combat, pushed through blast-torn corridors and scorched compounds where cartel fighters had once bunkered. In the immediate aftermath, commanders reported dozens of insurgents killed and a number detained. However, independent verification of precise casualty figures remained difficult amid the fog of night operations and conflicting claims from regional actors. Journalists and international monitors later noted that while the strikes degraded the cartel's physical infrastructure, they also sparked strong diplomatic backlash and questions about proportionality and legal authority. Most strategically significant was what the ground teams found inside the wreckage. Not only chemical vats and processing rigs, but digital ledgers and encrypted drives that pointed to a broader financial architecture. Those files contained timestamps, shipping manifests, and transaction trails through Panama and Hong Kong, linking production sites to money laundering fronts. Analysts describe this discovery as the operation's true prize. Documents that could map the chain from product to profit and identify the officials and firms that enabled the network to run. In short, the raid combined the blunt instrument of aerial firepower with the finesse of targeted special operations to both destroy and document. Yet the operation carried costs beyond the battlefield. The dramatic images of bomb craters and nighttime insertions were seized upon by Caracas and its allies as evidence of overreach, drawing condemnations and calls for legal accountability at the United Nations level. Meanwhile, Washington framed the mission as a necessary step to protect the homeland, arguing that the narco state's reach had become a direct threat. For viewers trying to make sense of the sequence, from a freighter's seizure to a midnight bombardment to door-to-door raids in a smoking compound, the central question remains visceral and immediate. If you were the commander on the scene, would you accept a strike that risked diplomatic uproar to sever a billion-dollar criminal network? Or would you wait for more time and possibly let the enemy disperse? In the smoking aftermath of the first airstrikes and ground raids, U.S. intelligence teams peeled back layer after layer of secrecy. Among the wreckage retrieved from the Venezuelan complex was a data trove described as 2.44 terabytes of intelligence by U.S. officials, a staggering volume that included money flow charts, lead sheets naming 17 Venezuelan officials, and corporate cover sheets registered in Panama and Hong Kong. What those files exposed was not simply a trafficking cell, but a full-blown financial engine and power structure hidden beneath the guise of a legitimate state. Analysts found that the money did not simply change hands, it was embedded. Some of it passed through dummy import-export firms, where shipments of sugar, coffee, or crude oil were invoiced far above market rates. Other funds were converted into gold, yachts, and real estate abroad, classic money laundering moves that tied the cartel's production sites directly into Venezuela's security apparatus. A collective of intelligence agencies concluded this was not just a criminal enterprise, it was a parallel governance network sustained by the machinery of state. In other words, the operation took aim not only at factories and camps, but at the structure of power itself. The strategic calculus behind Operation Iron Tide reflected that insight. Destroying physical infrastructure was only part of the mission. Washington sought to lay bare the web of financial relationships that enabled the network to function year after year. By uncovering the ledgers, shell corporations, and asset trails, U.S. planners believed that the collapse of this narco power would ripple far beyond the factory floor. And early indicators seemed to validate that belief. In the wake of the operation, maritime intelligence reported that major drug shipments heading from Colombia through the Caribbean route dropped by approximately 50% within 24 hours. That figure, though still provisional, resonated across Washington agencies as proof that the assault had delivered more than explosives. It had disrupted business. For decades, the Caribbean corridor had served as a major flow path for illegal drugs. Suddenly, it was paralyzed. Some senior U.S. officials described the moment as tipping the table under a narco state and raising the cost of doing business for every player inside. Yet the revelation also came with diplomatic risk. The government in Caracas accused the United States of invasion and violation of sovereignty, an accusation that Washington met with a single response: justice delivered. As the network's architecture was exposed in public and private documents, the delicate balance of power inside Venezuela shifted. Sons and daughters of security officers once protected by the flow of illicit funds found themselves under scrutiny. Shell company owners who once operated in shadow were named in indictments. The message was clear. When financial systems supporting violence get attacked, the battlefield moves from jungle camps to boardrooms and government halls. For our viewers, the significance is plain. The raid was not simply about bombs or black helicopters. It was about data, money, and embedded power structures. The men and women behind the network believed they were untouchable because they hid behind flags and titles. The U.S. response aimed to expose them. And when you see that drop in shipment volume, you realize this may have been one of the few times in recent memory that a state-level strike didn't just dismantle a factory, it fractured the backbone of a narco state. In less than 72 hours, a single freighter intercepted in the Caribbean spiraled into one of the fastest and most complex military operations of the decade. What began as a quiet Coast Guard pursuit ended with B-52 bombers roaring over Venezuela, special forces storming fortified compounds, and an empire worth $4.8 billion collapsing beneath its own corruption. The mission, known as Operation Iron Tide, revealed not only how far organized crime had merged with state power, but also how far the United States was willing to go to stop it. For U.S. intelligence, the lesson was immediate. Modern conflict no longer wears uniforms or flies national flags. It hides in offshore accounts, encrypted servers, and trade routes disguised as commerce. When those barriers fall, airstrikes replace court summons, and satellite feeds become the new front line. In this case, the war was fought without a formal declaration, guided instead by data, surveillance, and a single signature in the White House Situation Room. It showed that in the 21st century, war can begin not with speeches, but with a radar signal and a decision made before dawn. The wider message resonated far beyond Venezuela. It reminded the world that when crime cloaks itself in the symbols of governance, justice can arrive from the sky. For Washington, the operation marked both a tactical victory and a strategic statement, a warning that geography no longer guarantees immunity and that the reach of U.S. power extends wherever illicit empires threaten global stability. Reports following the strikes noted that within 2 days, drug shipments through the Caribbean fell sharply and regional traffickers went silent, unsure of who might be targeted next. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Military Power to uncover the next chapter in the world's silent wars.